If you're in Canada, chances are you've seen this deepfake YouTube ad come up recently. I got curious and decided to dig into it. And in this video, I'll walk you through my investigation, including how I traced the scam back to its source, and eventually took the entire campaign down, costing the scammer quite dearly in the process, and sabotaging their access to the victims they were trying to target. Now, nothing demonstrated here is going to be anything too crazy, but I think it serves as a reminder of how greedy some of these scammers are, and the lengths that they'll go to steal money from hardworking people. So it all started when I came across the ad itself. All in all, I think I was shown this ad at least 3 times before I decided to look into it, but for reasons which we'll get into soon, I wasn't able to get a full recording of it because, well, it no longer exists, so bear with me. But in this ad, we have Prime Minister Mark Carney talking about a very exciting investment or benefit program for Canadians to sign up for and receive money. Now, who wouldn't want that? Now, I only need to play a second or two of this audio for you to tell that it's very obviously a deepfake.
And we've built a state-of-the-art program to help Canadians be part of it.
And in fact, a quick search will show that the original video was taken from the Prime Minister's Canada Day address. Now, I got curious and started pulling on this thread. And when I did, by clicking on the ad, I was taken over to a Typeform landing page. Now, what I've done here in my sandbox is simulate that effect. And Typeform is a web service that allows you to create online forms or surveys or quizzes, very similar to Google Forms or SurveyMonkey. And they configured it in a way where as soon as you navigate to the page, it redirects you to the first staging site of this scam. Now, why would they do that? Why would they use Typeform? Well, for flexibility most likely. When setting up the YouTube ad, they provided this Typeform URL as the call to action so that they could essentially route victims wherever they wanted. So if one piece of the puzzle got shut down or had to move, they could just update their redirection to that new malicious website. And we actually see this kind of thing quite commonly in phishing cases. Also, it rides the wave of trust that an already established platform like Typeform has, along with its TLS certificate and domain reputation, giving it this veneer of legitimacy. And so back to that first landing page that really sets the victim up for this scam. As we can see here, it's impersonating a CBC News article, and it does a pretty good job at that. The only issue here is that this is clearly not the official CBC News website. It claims that a new retaliatory tariff plan has been set up called Can First, along with an entirely AI-generated interview. And if you stop to read it, it's actually pretty strange. The premise is that anyone can go ahead and register to this new platform, and upon doing so, you'll get a call from your account manager to get verified. Along with this, you just need to deposit $350 into the account in order to purchase this new digital currency. In fact, this scam is apparently so lucrative that the AI-generated interviewer already made $46 just by sitting there. It even has a number of fake comments under this article of all these happy customers. And so, surely this has to be a real thing. Well, the call to action in this article is to visit the official website to go ahead and sign up and deposit the funds, and then wait for an operator to call. And this link here takes us over to the next stage of this scam. Now, this next site is the actual information harvesting portion. Now, this is where the scammer gets victims to sign up and provide personally identifiable information that they can use to then follow up with and actually steal money. And of course, the domain here is non-official and immediately suspect. I decided to fill out the form with fake information just so I could capture the post request and find out where exactly my submitted information is being sent. And when I did, I saw that the request was directed over to a completely different domain called gojavascript.online. Interesting. And so just to recap, we have the original Typeform redirection over to the fake news article. This article then takes us over to the sign-up form, which sends the submitted data over to this third website. And I checked the domain reputation of all 3 of these suspicious domains, and they were all registered very recently. In fact, just within a few days of each other. Now, you might be thinking, who would even fall for this, right? It doesn't take much to see how this is obviously not a legitimate opportunity. Well, this is where things get really interesting. My next step was to check out this gojavascript.online domain and see what was up. I don't think the scammer anticipated anyone getting to this server. In fact, I know that they didn't because they made the extremely dumb mistake of leaving the entire site directory publicly indexed. And so this meant that I could see and interact with every single file sitting on the server. Every folder, every script, every log, every resource that powers the scam is just sitting there out in the open, accessible to anyone who happens to stumble across it. Now at the top here, we have some vendor folders, which include repositories of common PHP frameworks and libraries. And then one we'll come back to in a moment, Twilio, which is a service for sending texts and making phone calls. But what really jumped out to me here were these various text files. For example, when my information was sent over to this website, it was handled by the go-mp.php endpoint. Right next to it, we have a seemingly paired go-mp.txt file. And when I opened up this text file, I realized it was a massive log file containing thousands of entries, all of which included the personal details of each victim that fell for this scam. This included each victim's full name, an email, phone number, and their general location, even down to metadata like their IP address and user agent, or in other words, the fingerprint of the device or operating system and browser that they were using at the time of collection. And so I'm pretty much going to have to redact everything here because this log file is sadly just full of real victims. And just looking through some of these entries was pretty disheartening, especially because a good number of these email addresses included years from the 1960s or other similar indicators that this scam is targeting people who are older and might not be as technically savvy. What really made this interesting is that the logs also gave a roadmap of how each victim got there in the first place. So each entry included this kind of funnel field, which acted like a tag showing which campaign or method lured the victim into the trap. And then there are these various subfields, which gave an even more detailed chain of events. In some cases, you could literally trace the victim's path step by step, starting out from YouTube, clicking on a sponsored ad, getting redirected to a certain landing page, and finally ending up on the actual fake sign-in form where their details were harvested. And so, scope-wise, we're now talking about multiple active campaigns, all branching off from different sources, but feeding back into the same backend infrastructure. This can-first deepfake is only the tip of the iceberg. And so with that aside, the thing that really stuck out to me was just how careless these operators were in storing all of this. So I figured if they were this careless about locking down their server, what other OPSEC failures might be lurking in the data? Well, I got my answer pretty quickly. The log file was written to in chronological order. And so each entry included things like a timestamp, along with the post data array, which contained the actual victim's information, along with the raw request in JSON. Now, these logs were pretty much coming in real time, and so I could refresh the page and see yet another batch of victims continuing to populate it at the bottom. Now, my natural instinct was to go back in time and see what the very first set of entries look like. And sure enough, the earliest logs painted a pretty clear picture of when this campaign first went live. So the first 20 or so entries all came from around the same time range on August 6th, just a few days after the domains were registered, and also a few weeks before the campaign really started showing up in YouTube ads. Based on the data, the actual victims don't start coming in until around the 21st. And so what was going on during August 6th? Well, every single one of these early submissions contained very obvious test data with placeholder names and dummy emails and so on, right? I was fairly confident that this was the scammers themselves testing their own form to make sure that everything worked before flipping the switch and going live. But what they likely overlooked here was the IP address logging and the location data that was being captured alongside those early submissions. And so unlike the actual victims of the scam, which were all logged from Canadian IP addresses and locations, each of these test submissions were traced back to the same IP address in Spain. Specifically, after doing a lookup on that IP address that was connected to all of these entries, it returned to an organization called Exfera Mobiles SA, which is, from my research, a telecom provider out of Spain. So what this tells me is that during the testing phase, the scammers were very likely operating out of Spain using mobile internet connections to push through their own dummy test submissions. Now this is a pretty big OPSEC slip, and instead of masking their activity behind a VPN or a proxy or some kind of anonymizing service, they essentially left a breadcrumb trail pointing right back to the network that they were using at the time. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that I've got their exact home address or anything, but it does start to narrow down their geographic footprint in a way that they probably didn't intend. And so all of that aside, I knew that I had to act quickly because more and more victims were being written to this log file in real time. And so I wrote a quick script using Python's requests library to fetch the content from this log file, and then use regular expressions to extract out every single individual email address. Now, after cleaning up this listing by going in and removing any obviously fake entries, there were quite a few "fu scammer" at scammer.com and similar vulgar entries by folks who obviously caught on to the scheme, which was nice to see. We were eventually down to 450 potential victims. It wasn't clear what stage of the scam each of these victims were at, but at $350 per person, that's like a $150,000 payday for the scammer if these folks weren't warned in time. At this point, I partnered up with a colleague of mine and we hopped into a call to jump into response mode. And he was able to draft up a clear and informative email to individually reach out to all of the potential victims in our list and basically explain what happened and warn them of the scam and provide guidance on how to avoid any more exposure. During this escapade, another log file on the server caught my attention. This one was called otp_request.log, and it seemed to match up with the sendotp.php page. Now, I never managed to get myself far enough into the scam to figure out what exactly this send OTP function was used for exactly, but I could make a pretty solid inference based on the initial logs in the text file here. From what I could see, the script was trying to send one-time passwords or OTP codes to a series of phone numbers. And this is where Twilio comes back into play. Now, Twilio is a communication platform that allows developers to programmatically send SMS messages or make phone calls, and basically handle other messaging services through the use of APIs. It's also commonly abused for these kinds of malicious use cases. And so what I suspect was being done here is that the scam had a function designed to lure victims into a false sense of security. Once the account manager reaches out to the victim to receive their $350 deposit, they would request a PIN code from the victim, which was sent from the Twilio API over to the victim's phone to make it look more legitimate. All while doing this, the scammer might use that false sense of security to also steal credentials or other bank account information during this fake sign-up process. And so a lot of this campaign's success hinges on the scammer being able to make these Twilio API requests and send texts and calls to their victims. If I could target that part of the operation, I could effectively cut off the main delivery mechanism for the scam and significantly reduce the scammer's reach and potential profit. This brings us into the idea of offensive countermeasures and actively engaging adversaries. Now, offensive countermeasures are these proactive actions that we can take to directly disrupt or degrade or neutralize an attacker's tools or infrastructure. More colloquially, this means to fight back against attackers. But taken to the extreme, well, now we're getting into the very legal and ethical gray areas of hacking back. And so, for the sake of legality, everything I'm about to talk about is hypothetical. It did not actually happen. But if it did, this is probably how I would do it. Let's say that I navigated over to the send otp.php page, and based on the JSON response I got, I saw that it's likely expecting a phone number within the post data parameters. After experimenting with a few different test phone numbers using curl requests, let's say hypothetically that I was finally able to get a successful response where an OTP code was sent. And let's say that someone, not me by the way, someone used an online burner phone service as a proof of concept to demonstrate that these text messages are in fact being sent from the scammer's Twilio account. And let's say that each of these text messages that are sent from this function are costing the scammer 0.0083 cents each. Putting that all together, imagine if someone wrote a script to continually flood that API endpoint with requests, basically forcing the system to generate and text these codes nonstop. And based on my hypothetical reaction here, you could see just how stoked I would hypothetically be if this were to hypothetically happen. Holy f***, this guy's f***ed. And so while the initial script was running, I wrote an improved version 2, which was a bit more refined to use multiple threads and ultimately handle a large number of concurrent requests more efficiently, really allowing it to scale up. At that point, I hypothetically sat back and hypothetically waited while the preemptive warnings were sent out to each victim. I then gathered documentation so that I could report all the scammer's infrastructure to the relevant platforms and abuse contacts. After some time, the requests started to fail. Yeah, 30 plus. Oh, they're failing now. It's done. After looking through the documentation, this error message is due to the scammer's Twilio account running out of funds. And this tracks, because in total, around 100,000 requests were made between the various scripts, and grabbing the line count from that OTP file, filtered to today's entries, confirms that by showing just over 120,000 lines. And you can do the math here. At 0.0083 cents per message, I can just imagine the scammer logging in to check how many victims their campaign pulled in today, only to find out that they were mysteriously charged roughly $1,000 by thousands of random phone numbers before their account was shut down. Because that's the other thing. The side effect of these scripts continually hammering the server with requests was that the log files themselves, which contained the actual victim information to follow up on, were poisoned, and nonsense data eventually rolled over the old entries. And knowing how sloppy they'd already been up to this point, I highly doubt the scammer kept any backups. And so they ended up both getting charged and also losing their precious data, effectively bringing their operations to a halt, at least for the time being. Because we still had some more work to do. All of the domains in this scam were hosted through the Namecheap registrar, and the infrastructure itself was hosted through DigitalOcean. And so once I'd gathered enough evidence, right, all the different screenshots of the malicious sites, the logs containing victim information, and the connections tying everything back to the same operator, I began the long and ponderous task of filing abuse reports. Fortunately, like most providers, Namecheap and DigitalOcean maintain dedicated abuse contacts. And when presented with clear reports of active fraud, they tend to act quickly and suspend the domains and disable the instances powering the scam infrastructure. I didn't get any footage of it, but I also did the same process for Typeform, where the original landing page was hosted, YouTube itself, where the ad was running, and also on Twilio, where the scammer's messaging infrastructure was being managed. At this point, emails started coming in as replies to the preemptive warnings that we sent out to victims earlier. And I mean, they really started coming in. From that evening into the next morning and a few days afterwards, the inbox was flooded with messages. For the most part, they were simple acknowledgements and thank yous, which was a nice, heartwarming change to see that early intervention and getting ahead of the adversary actually made a tangible difference for real, actual people. Sadly, though, we weren't able to reach everyone in time. Some responses were from victims asking how they could get their money back, or expressing concern that they'd already lost funds, which was just a sobering reminder of how quickly these scams can move. But still, it felt good knowing that, thanks to us, many people were able to avoid becoming victims and were able to take protective action. And so to bookend this journey, by the next morning, every piece of relevant infrastructure that I documented up to this point was now taken down, cutting off the scammer's ability to lure in new victims and making the entire operation that much harder to sustain. Not only that, but they were also down $1,000 and likely lost their log files in the process. Beyond that, there wasn't much more I could do directly. At this point, the responsibility shifts to the platforms themselves to enforce their own rules. Right? For instance, my question during all of this was, how was an ad like this even allowed on YouTube in the first place? You have videos being taken down and strikes being given out all the time for not following YouTube's content policy. Why does so many ads like this slip through the cracks? Are there even cracks to slip through? And are there even any guardrails or checks done by the platform? Or do they just see the advertisement checks come through and conveniently look the other way? And I'm not even talking about the malicious websites and redirections. The advertisement itself was a blatant deepfake of a world leader. How does that get through? And so, I guess that's it. I don't really know if there's a takeaway from this story, other than the fact that deepfakes are quickly becoming the most reliable tool in a scammer's toolkit. It's important that we educate people on what warning signs to look for. Right? No matter how much infrastructure gets taken down, scammers will always find new ways to pop back up. And so the real long-term defense is awareness. But all of that aside, I hope you found the investigation both eye-opening and hopefully entertaining nonetheless. And with that, thank you for watching and take care.